The Blood Bank on Wheels. The Filipina Angels who redefined courage during World War II. Manila, December 1941. During World War II, the sky was a canvas of fire. Bombs howled through the morning like falling thunder. When the dust cleared, hospitals overflowed, blood ran down staircases, and medicine shelves stood bare. Amid the screams and chaos, a handful of women refused to run. They weren't soldiers, they were nurses, Filipina, underpaid, under-equipped, and now under siege. As the Japanese invasion advanced across Luzon, doctors fled, hospitals collapsed, and blood banks went dry. But these women, daughters of farmers, teachers, and seamstresses, turned ambulances, trucks, and even old buses into something unthinkable: mobile blood banks. By night, they hid under blackout curtains, sterilizing instruments with alcohol and moonlight. By day, they raced through shellfire, carrying plasma in glass bottles packed with ice scavenged from melting coolers. Their work would save thousands of lives, Filipino and American alike, and change the face of battlefield medicine forever. History called them the Angels of Bataan, but their true miracle was not faith. It was science, sacrifice, and sisterhood on wheels.
Act 1. The Day the Sky Fell. During World War II, it began not with a trumpet of war, but with the dull rumble of thunder that wasn't thunder at all. December 8, 1941. Manila was still half asleep when the sky turned black. Children chasing kites stopped mid-run. Pigeons exploded into the air as sirens wailed across the bay. "What's that sound?" asked a young nurse, her voice trembling. "That," replied another, "is history landing on our heads." Within minutes, Japanese bombers descended on Clark Air Base and Cavite Naval Yard, painting the horizon red. Windows shattered, roofs peeled off like paper, and the smell of burning fuel spread through the city like gossip. At St. Luke's and Philippine General Hospital, every corridor became a war zone. Beds were filled with the burned, the bleeding, and the barely breathing. The nurses didn't scream, they moved, fast. Maria Ilagan Orosa, the chemist nurse who could turn bananas into flour and soybeans into life-saving protein, took command of chaos like a general in white. "Bandages, blood, more light," she shouted, even as the electricity died with a sputter. They had no time for fear, no space for rest. Within hours, blood reserves were gone. "How can we give life when we've run out of it?" one nurse whispered, wiping her forehead with a sleeve that used to be white. Then came an idea, part desperation, part genius. "If we can't bring the wounded to the hospital," Orosa said, "we'll bring the hospital to the wounded." The younger nurses blinked. "On foot?" "No," she grinned, "on wheels." And so began the transformation. They commandeered old ambulances, buses, even ice delivery trucks. A driver named Ramon, who had once ferried movie stars, now ferried miracles. "Never thought I'd be carrying blood instead of gossip," he joked, adjusting his cap. "At least blood doesn't talk back." By candlelight, they cleaned the interiors, wiped glass bottles, labeled them in pencil, and packed them in makeshift ice boxes lined with straw and salt. The nurses called it the blood bank on wheels. Others called it madness. But by midnight, when the first convoy rattled down Dewey Boulevard, no one was laughing. They worked without gloves, sterilizing needles over kerosene flames, sweating in their masks, humming hymns and old folk songs to stay awake. One nurse quipped, "If we live through this, I'm charging rent to death for using our hospital as his office." The others laughed, then went right back to work. Every trip was a gamble. Roads were cratered, bridges gone, skies full of screaming metal birds. When the engines roared, some prayed, others cursed, and one would always say, "If we die, at least we'll die on duty, and maybe get a holiday named after us." They didn't know it yet, but they had just invented the world's first mobile blood unit, a concept that would later save millions in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. That night, as the trucks rolled into the burning outskirts at Manila, the women inside looked more like soldiers than nurses, armed not with rifles, but with compassion bottled in glass. And as bombs thundered in the distance, a radio announcer's faint voice broke through the static. To all medical personnel, do what you can, where you are, with what you have. They did, and more. Act 2. The Angels of Bataan. During World War II, the trucks rattled south toward Bataan, a strip of jungle peninsula that would soon become the last stand of the Philippines. Manila was declared an open city, but bombs don't read proclamations. The nurses knew what that meant. Hospitals left behind, roads choked with refugees, and death hitchhiking on every vehicle that still moved. Inside one of the Bled trucks, Nurse Florentino, barely 22, gripped the steering wheel with both hands. She'd never driven before. "You sure this thing runs?" she asked. Ramon, their driver-turned-mechanic, grinned. "It runs on faith and coconut oil." The engine coughed like an old man clearing his throat, then roared to life. They all laughed, the kind of laugh that sounds brave because it's covering fear. The journey to Bataan took days. Bridges had been bombed, and soldiers flagged them down at every checkpoint, begging for supplies. The nurses handed out whatever they had: gauze, iodine, and sometimes just a smile. "Sorry, soldier, all I have left is advice and sarcasm." By the time they reached Limay, the peninsula was a field hospital without walls. Bamboo huts, makeshift tents, wounded men on stretchers. It looked like a painting of chaos. Flies buzzed over the wounded. The smell of gangrene hung thick in the air. They went to work without orders, without complaint. Nurse Catalina Santos, her uniform ripped and mud-stained, began boiling water in a helmet. Another hung plasma bottles from tree branches. They ran extension cords from trucks to huts, turning the jungle into a jungle of light. "You're angels," whispered a delirious soldier as they tied a tourniquet on his leg. "Angel?" laughed Santos. "I'm sweating like the devil." Still, the name stuck. Word spread among the troops. "The Angels of Bataan have arrived." The women shrugged it off. Angels? Maybe, but angels with mosquito bites, cracked hands, and no sleep for 3 days. At night, bombs lit up the jungle like fireworks. One nurse kept a running tally on the side of a truck. Patients saved, 47. Mosquito bites, 612. When asked why she kept count, she smiled. "Because when they ask what we did in the war, I can say, we fought insects and death at the same time." Even humor became medicine. One evening, a soldier begged them to sing. They hesitated until Nurse Orosa began humming Bahay Kubo. The men joined in, their voices broken but determined. The jungle seemed to hum with them, as if the trees themselves wanted to remember home. But behind every laugh was exhaustion. The nurses barely ate, surviving on rice porridge and canned sardines. Their uniforms turned gray with sweat. And still they worked, amputating, transfusing, cleaning, praying. When a wounded American sergeant asked how they could still smile, Nurse Florentino replied, "Because if we stop smiling, the blood might stop flowing." It wasn't just courage that kept them alive. It was defiance. They were Filipinas, born in a land that had endured colonizers, earthquakes, and typhoons. A few bombs weren't going to take their spirit. On one of those sleepless nights, Orosa scribbled in her journal by candlelight. "We bleed, we stitch, we give, and we laugh," perhaps to prove that compassion is stronger than conquest. By dawn, they'd saved another 50 men. The trucks, which were once white, were now red and brown with dust and blood. And yet, as the sun rose over Bataan, someone joked, "Maybe after the war we'll open a hospital with wheels." Another replied, "Sure, and charge extra for every bump in the road." The laughter that followed was half hysteria, half heroism, but it kept them going. Act 3.
Blood and Bamboo. During World War II, Bataan was no longer a battlefield, it was a body. Every hill was a wound, every tree a rib, and in its veins, the nurses pumped life through bottles and hope through laughter. The trucks that once looked heroic now looked half dead. Busted tires, cracked windshields, one held together with bamboo and a prayer. The women called them our rolling coffins. Ramon, the mechanic, wiped grease on his shorts and said, "If death tries to hitch a ride, make him pay the fare." "Half price for ghosts," answered Nurse Catalina. The laughter was thin, but it worked a kind of anesthesia for the soul. Improvisation as survival. Supplies were gone. No gauze, no morphine, no clean needles. So they invented medicine from the jungle. Leaves became bandages. Bamboo tubes became IV stands. When the last generator sputtered out, they ran the blood units by gravity and bamboo. The soldiers nicknamed it Drip Drip Express. Orosa, ever the chemist, ground papaya seeds into disinfectant. "Smells like salad," groaned a soldier. "Then you're lucky you'll die with flavor," she teased. Behind the jokes was desperation. The Japanese were closing in. Every day the nurses drove deeper into the forest, hiding trucks beneath banana leaves and covering headlights with rags. They worked by candlelight and moonlight, sometimes both. When a nurse accidentally dropped a plasma bottle, everyone froze as it shattered. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Ramon muttered, "At least now the ants will have strong blood." The nurses laughed until they cried, because if they didn't laugh, they'd scream. The secret of the ice. Blood couldn't last long in the tropical heat, so the nurses became smugglers of cold. They stole ice from abandoned canteens, traded it for cigarettes, and packed it in sawdust. "Ice is our gold," said Orosa. When a soldier asked how they'd managed to keep it from melting, a nurse winked, "We scare it with Japanese planes." Hope on wheels. Every morning before sunrise, the trucks rolled again, slow, rattling, unstoppable. The jungle road chewed tires. The sky spat rain. But the nurses kept going, singing folk songs between shell bursts. They became mythic figures to the soldiers. Men too weak to walk would whisper, "Are the angels coming today?" And when the women arrived, covered in mud, someone would always whisper, "Told you, angels drive trucks now." One afternoon, Orosa overheard a young private telling a riddle to pass the time. "What's red, rides on wheels, and makes the devil jealous?" The others guessed bullets, blood, even death. He smiled. "The nurses." Even amid tragedy, wit was the currency of courage. The price of blood. Each bottle of plasma meant someone's arm pricked, someone's fear swallowed. The nurses gave their own blood more times than they admitted. Florentina fainted once during a transfusion. When she woke up, she groaned, "At least I know my blood works." By now their faces were hollow, their eyes rimmed with soot and fever, yet their spirits refused to crack. They took shifts of 20 hours, resting in hammocks strung between trucks, listening to the crickets gossip about war. At night, when bombs fell nearby, they whispered stories from home of fiestas, of first loves, of mothers who would have told them to sleep. "One day," said Catalina, "we'll tell our children bedtime stories about mosquitoes and miracles." But dawn brought more wounded, more work, more wheels rolling through the jungle. And somewhere between laughter and exhaustion, they realized they had built not just a blood bank, but a brotherhood,
a sisterhood, a lifeline that stretched through the smoke of war. When they finally paused, one nurse scribbled on the side of the truck with chalk, "If you see this truck, hope is nearby."
Act 4. The Fall of Bataan. During World War II, by April 1942, Bataan had become a bleeding peninsula. The jungle was no longer green. It was gray with smoke, yellow with fever, and red with everything else. Food was gone. Medicine was gone. Hope was the only thing still on the supply list. The nurses were shadows of themselves, thinner, quieter, faces streaked with dust and soot. Yet when dawn came, they stood again, wrapping wounds, checking pulses, whispering, "It's all right, we're here," even when it wasn't. Every truck, every bottle, every heartbeat counted now. The Japanese artillery began pounding the front lines like a drumbeat of doom. Inside one of the mobile blood trucks, Nurse Florentino scribbled in her notebook, "We used to count lives saved. Now we count minutes." They were exhausted, starving, but stubborn. Maria Arosa kept inventing, mixing coconut water as emergency IV fluid, turning banana peels into antiseptic poultices. "It's not science," she joked, "it's sorcery with degrees." A soldier nearby laughed weakly. "Then bless me, witch doctor, I'm out of blood." The humor was brittle, laughter held together by tape and terror. By April 8th, the line broke. Bataan fell. The radio went silent. The last transmission was just static and a trembling voice saying, "God bless the Philippines." When angels became prisoners, the nurses didn't flee. They couldn't. Their trucks were surrounded, their patients too weak to move. When Japanese soldiers marched in, the women stood side by side, hands behind their backs, still wearing their Red Cross armbands. One officer sneered, "Why do you stay?" Nurse Santos answered simply, "Because they bleed." Silence. Even the officer looked away. They were ordered to evacuate toward Mariveles, alongside thousands of captured soldiers. The road became a river of suffering, what history would call the Bataan Death March. The nurses walked barefoot, carrying what they could: a bandage, a bottle, a prayer. Some soldiers begged for water. The women tore strips from their skirts, soaked them in puddles, and placed them on cracked lips. One soldier asked, "Are we going to die?" A nurse smiled faintly and said, "Not today. Death's too tired to keep up." Even the guards didn't know whether to laugh or cry. A game with death. At night, they whispered riddles to distract the wounded. What walks in daylight, bleeds at night, and never forgets? "What?" asked a dying soldier. "A nurse." He smiled before he went silent. They buried him with the riddle unfinished. The last drive. One truck, their oldest, rustiest blood bank, still worked. Ramon had hidden it in a ravine, camouflaged under palm leaves. When the order came to surrender vehicles, he muttered, "They'll get it over my dead gearbox." At midnight, with headlights off, they drove into the jungle, carrying a dozen wounded soldiers. The engine coughed and sputtered, but kept going, just like the people inside. They reached Kabkaben, the last Allied field post. There, surrounded by chaos, they transfused the final bottles of plasma they had left. A young corporal, barely conscious, whispered, "You'll be remembered." Arosa smiled sadly, "Only if you tell the story." Then the bombs fell again. They huddled inside the truck, 10 women, 2 drivers, a handful of wounded. Outside, the forest burned. Inside, a candle flickered. Florentino whispered, "If we live through this, I'm never donating blood again." Santos chuckled, "You'll donate, just not voluntarily." and through the fear they laughed again, that mad, fragile laughter that meant we're still alive. When dawn rose over the smoking hills of Bataan, the truck was silent, but the candle still burned. It was the last night the blood bank on wheels would ever run under the Philippine flag.
Act 5. Angels in Captivity. During World War II, the surrender of Bataan was not the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of battle. One fought not with blood and bullets, but with hunger, disease, and dignity. The captured nurses, around 70 in total, were herded into Camp O'Donnell, then later to Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. The world called them prisoners, but the prisoners called them angels still. Inside the camp, the nurses traded their starched whites for rags and mosquito bites. They slept on bamboo mats, ate rice that even rats ignored, and treated wounds with nothing more than boiled leaves and stubborn faith. The Japanese guards didn't know what to make of them. They saluted no one, feared no one, and when shouted at, sometimes smiled. One guard, frustrated, yelled, "You think you are brave?" Nurse Santos replied, "No, just busy." Medicine in the shadows. Supplies were forbidden, yet somehow medicines kept appearing. Bandages made from torn shirts, saline solution brewed from salt and boiled water. They even made antiseptic out of ashes and coconut oil, a formula Orosa claimed she'd invented after dinner one night out of boredom. When a guard asked what they were cooking, she said, "Soup for the sick." He didn't realize she meant courage. The nurses turned the women's dormitory into an underground hospital. They used broken glass as scalpels, razor blades as surgical tools, and their bare hands when all else failed. When someone asked where they got new supplies, they'd joke, "We write to God, delivery slow, but guaranteed." They also organized what they called the Midnight Clinic, tending secretly to wounded Filipino resistance fighters. Smuggled into the camp under false identities. If caught, they'd be executed, but still they treated. "Better to die healing," said one nurse, "than to live watching others bleed." The power of small things. In a world stripped bare, even a smile became contraband. When they found a stray cat wandering into camp, they named it General. It became their unofficial mascot and therapy animal. "Why General?" asked a young boy prisoner. "Because it eats first," said Nurse Florentino. "And it doesn't take orders," added Santos. The jokes spread through the camp. Laughter became their weapon, soft, invisible, impossible to confiscate. When they ran out of soap, they used sand. When they ran out of hope, they used humor. Orosa once held a mock medical conference assigning everyone fake titles. Chief of Cockroach Control, Deputy of Dishwashing Operations, Head of Mosquito Research and Revenge. They laughed until tears replaced tears. And that night, even the guards seemed less frightening. The legend spread. Word of their courage slipped through cracks in the wire. Prisoners whispered tales of the Filipina nightingales. American soldiers said they'd seen them during the march and thought they were hallucinations. "No," one insisted, "they were real. They drove trucks made of angels." Even Japanese medics, secretly impressed, began sneaking bandages and aspirin to them under the table. One whispered, "You heal our enemies." "Why?" Orosa smiled. "Because pain speaks no language." The price of compassion, but courage came at a cost. Disease stalked the camp like a slow predator. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid. The nurses treated everyone but themselves. One by one, they began to fall sick. Florentino collapsed during rounds. Her temperature spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. When she woke up, she found a straw hat beside her cot. Someone had written on it in charcoal, "Rest, Captain. The army of compassion awaits orders." Even in sickness, she laughed and then got back up. The joke that saved a life. Once, a guard threatened to beat a young prisoner who had stolen rice. Santos stepped forward, heart hammering. "If you must hit someone, hit me. I'm a senior officer in charge of trouble." The guard hesitated, then lowered his stick.
Later that night, the boy brought her half a banana. "Ma'am," he whispered, "it's from the kitchen." Santos smiled. "Tell the kitchen they're promoted to heaven."
Act 6. The Secret Network. During World War II, the camp was surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by bayonets and suspicion. But the nurses had something sharper than blades of imagination. They had already survived bombs, hunger, and humiliation. Now, they would survive by outsmarting their captors. The walls of Santa Tomas had ears, but they also had cracks. And through those cracks, secrets began to move, wrapped in bandages, hidden in laundry, carried by kindness. Operation Salamit started small. One day, a nurse named Luz found a folded note tucked inside a rice sack. "Need quinine. Resistance. Marikina." It was signed only with a red cross drawn in pencil. She showed it to Arosa and Santos during evening rounds. They said nothing, just nodded. That night, they began Operation Salamit, a quiet system of smuggling medicine and information to guerrilla fighters beyond the camp. They used blood-stained bandages as code sheets. If a bandage had 3 knots, it meant safe route. If it had 4, it meant danger ahead. The nurses laughed about it openly to throw off suspicion. "We're just bad at sewing," one would joke if a guard looked too long. The invisible messengers. The women made allies in the unlikeliest of places: cooks, laundry workers, even a Japanese orderly named Tanaka, who had once been a medical student. Tanaka would pretend to deliver rations, but inside sacks of rice, he hid quinine tablets, vitamin C, and once an entire vial of penicillin stolen from the camp hospital. When asked why he risked it, he said, "My mother was a nurse. She said, 'Nurses don't have enemies.'" It was dangerous work. If caught, they could be executed. So they turned their smuggling into a game. They called it Bingo ng Buhay, bingo of life. Each letter stood for a different medicine. B for bandages, I for iodine, N for nutrition, food packets, G for gauze, O for ointment. Each time they succeeded, they'd whisper bingo and hide the evidence before dawn. The hidden clinic. As the war dragged on, disease hit the prisoners harder than bullets ever could. So the nurses built a secret clinic under a storage hut, dug into the ground, reinforced with bamboo and mud. It became a sanctuary for the sickest, a place where whispers of pain met whispers of prayer. They nicknamed it the Burrow. A soldier once said, "Feels like being born again, but with more mud." There, the nurses performed surgeries by candlelight, transfused blood drawn with sharpened needles, and sang quietly to drown out the groans. Florentino's voice carried best, clear and warm, like sunlight through fog. She'd hum Bayan Co, and even the crickets seemed to stop and listen. Codes and comedy. To avoid suspicion, they used humor as camouflage. Arosa once pretended to flirt with a guard just to distract him while another nurse smuggled a note under his chair. "Do you think I'm pretty?" she asked sweetly. The guard, blushing, nodded. "Then don't blink," she said, and walked away before he realized she'd just pocketed his pen. Their wit was their weapon. They told jokes that only the prisoners understood. What's the difference between malaria and the Japanese army? At least malaria leaves when the fever breaks. Everyone laughed, except the guards, who didn't get it. That made it even funnier. The Whisper Network. By 1944, their secret network had grown across half of Luzon. Messages from the resistance slipped through the camps like wind through grass. Some called it the lifeline, others the bloodline, but the nurses knew its true name: hope. They weren't just saving lives, now they were saving morale. Their hidden blood units, still functional even inside captivity, inspired copycats in other camps. American POWs later admitted, "Those Filipina nurses, they made us believe we hadn't been forgotten." When liberation finally loomed, the Japanese tightened control. Punishments grew brutal, yet the nurses didn't stop.
In the final months, as bombs echoed in the distance and Allied planes streaked the sky, Santos whispered to her group, "The world's bleeding again. Let's make sure it doesn't run out of nurses." They smiled, tired and brave. The secret network that began with a single note in a rice sack had become a legend on its own wheels, invisible, unstoppable, unforgettable.
Act 7. The Rescue and the Reckoning. During World War II, it came like thunder wrapped in rumor. First, a whisper, "The Americans are coming." Then a vibration in the air, distant artillery, the kind that shakes the ground and the heart at once. After 3 years of imprisonment, the nurses hardly dared believe it. They'd seen hope before. It usually came with disappointment, sometimes with bayonets. But this time felt different. The guards were nervous. The officers shouted more than usual. And at night, searchlights moved frantically across the sky, as if trying to stop freedom itself from landing. The day the gates shook. On February 3rd, 1945, the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp rattled with gunfire. American tanks rolled through the walls, crushing years of fear under their treads. The prisoners screamed, wept, and collapsed. The nurses? They ran not for safety, but for the wounded. Quote, "Angels don't retire," joked Nurse Florentino, grabbing a bandage as bullets whistled overhead. They turned the camp courtyard into a triage zone within minutes. Bullets hit the chapel walls, but they didn't stop. One nurse even scolded a soldier for bleeding on the floor. "Sir, at least try to aim for the bandage." When an American lieutenant saw them working in torn uniforms and slippers, he froze. "You're the nurses?" "Yes," Santos said. "Still on shift." For a moment, the chaos paused. Even war seemed to take a breath in respect. The reckoning. When the shooting stopped, the nurses stepped out of the shadows into daylight, gaunt, hollow-eyed, but unbroken. Liberation had come, but not without ghosts. Many of their fellow nurses had died of disease, starvation, or silent execution. Maria Arosa, the woman who once made soybeans sing, was gone, killed by shrapnel while volunteering in a bombed hospital just before the Americans arrived. When they told Florentino, she didn't cry. She just whispered, "Then she's not gone. She's just gone ahead to set up the next ward." They buried Arosa quietly, marking her grave with a red cross stitched from strips of a torn uniform. The survivors were airlifted to safety, but freedom felt heavy. They had dreamed of going home, but some homes were now ruins, others occupied by strangers. "Where do we go?" one asked on the flight out. Santos looked out the window at the smoldering city below and said, "Forward." The inventory of pain. At the hospital in Manila, U.S. doctors tried to interview them for reports. "How did you survive?" one asked. Quote, "Bad manners. We refused to die when told." They weighed barely 90 pounds each, with scars on their arms where blood had been drawn too many times for others. When one of the American surgeons saw the notes they'd kept, meticulous records of blood donors, plasma storage, and treatment, he muttered, "This is revolutionary." "No," Santos said. "It's Filipino." Their blood bank on wheels had inspired Allied medics to create similar mobile transfusion units in Europe. What began as a desperate improvisation in the jungles of Bataan had become a global standard in battlefield medicine. They didn't call themselves heroes. They called themselves tired. Humor amid the rubble. When reporters finally arrived, a journalist asked, "How did you manage without hope?" A nurse replied, "We had rice, sometimes." Another added, "Hope was too expensive. We paid in laughter." They even held a mock ceremony in the ruins of the hospital. Ramon, the old driver, presented each nurse with a makeshift medal made from melted bottle caps. He declared, "For bravery, stubbornness, and running engines on miracles." Everyone laughed. even as tears streaked the dust on their faces. Then Florentino raised her tin medal and said, "For all the blood we gave, may the world never forget who gave it first." And as the sun set over liberated Manila, its light fell on the bullet-pocked ambulance, still parked in the courtyard, rusted, cracked, but still upright. Someone had painted on its door, in shaky but proud letters, quote, "She carried more life than death."
Act 8. The War After the War. Liberation felt strange. There were parades, speeches, and brass bands, but for the nurses of Bataan, the noise felt hollow. They had seen too much to clap easily. When the first American officer tried to thank them, Nurse Florentina replied, "Sir, we'd rather have shoes." It wasn't sarcasm, it was exhaustion shaped like humor. The return. They were sent home one by one, thin as shadows, clutching what little they had. Some went back to their towns in Batangas, Pampanga, and Iloilo, only to find ashes where their homes once stood. Neighbors called them heroes, but heroes still had to rebuild roofs. One farmer told Santos, "You fought the Japanese?" She smiled faintly. "No, I fought dirt, disease, and despair. Japan was just a side effect." They were alive, but something inside them remained in the jungles of Bataan, buried with the bottles, the blood, and their fallen sisters. The ghosts in white. Sometimes they'd wake up at night to phantom sounds, the hum of engines, the faint dripping of plasma bottles, the whispered cries of soldiers calling "nurse" in their sleep. One evening, Florentino stood by a riverside and swore she heard Ramon's voice. "Engines fine, ma'am. Ready for another run." She smiled at the wind. "Rest now, you stubborn man." They missed even the chaos, because chaos had meaning. Peace, on the other hand, was quieter but heavier. A different kind of mission. Despite their trauma, they refused to fade into obscurity. The surviving nurses returned to hospitals, schools, and clinics, using everything they'd learned in war to modernize medicine across the Philippines. They trained a new generation of nurses to think fast, improvise, and never wait for perfect conditions to do good. One of their first students later said, "They taught us that the human heart has no pause button." Their mobile blood bank concept was documented by American medical officers and adopted into official war manuals. But when the credits rolled, their names were missing. Maria Orosa was remembered as a food scientist. Santos, Florentino, and the others became footnotes in military reports. Their heroism was quiet, unmarketable, and female, didn't fit the headlines. Men fought with guns, one historian later said. Santos answered, and women fought with what was left. The birth of a legacy. Years later, when the first Philippine Red Cross opened its post-war training facility, they used one of the old blood trucks as a teaching relic. Rusty, patched with bamboo, its wheels frozen in place, but its story alive. The nurses decorated it with flowers and candles. A sign on the hood read, "This truck once carried the nation's heartbeat." Children visiting the center would climb inside and ask, "Where did it go?" "Everywhere," replied Santos. "And who drove it?" "Courage." That same spirit spread beyond the Philippines. In 1946, American medical officers cited the Filipina mobile blood units as inspiration for field hospitals used in Korea and Vietnam. A quiet victory, unclaimed but undeniable.
The reunion. In 1950, the surviving nurses reunited in Manila for the first time since the war. They met in the courtyard of a new hospital, modern, shiny, sterile, too clean, almost. Ramon's daughter, now grown, attended the event. She presented them with a small silver plaque engraved with the words, "For every life you saved, another life continues your story." There were speeches, applause, and tears. Then Florentino raised a glass and said, "To those who healed the world on an empty stomach." Laughter broke through the ceremony. It was the same laughter that once filled jungle nights and prison walls. The final reflection. Before leaving, Santos placed her nurse's cap on the hospital memorial altar. "Let it rest here," she said. "It's done enough marching." Outside, a light rain began to fall softly, cleansing, like the earth itself exhaling. The women walked away in silence, their reflections shimmering in pools that looked eerily like pools of blood and memory. One whispered, "War takes everything." Florentino replied, "Yes, but it never takes kindness. That always sneaks back."
Act 9. Names written in blood. Time is a thief polite, patient, and efficient. It doesn't steal everything at once. It just erases names letter by letter until history begins to look tidy again. For decades after the war, the story of the Filipina blood bank on wheels slept in archives, hidden between pages that favored generals over nurses and medals over mercy. The silence of the official story. The newspapers of the 1950s wrote about tanks, invasions, and strategy, but not about women sterilizing scalpels with moonlight. Hollywood made films about MacArthur's return, but none about Orosa's last candlelit transfusion. When Santos was once asked to attend a military award ceremony, she laughed softly. "We already got our medals," she said, holding up her scarred hands. She wasn't bitter, just practical. Recognition doesn't clean wounds, but still, it stings to be forgotten. The rediscovery. In the 1970s, a young historian from the University of the Philippines named Liza Villanueva stumbled upon a box in the archives labeled Auxiliary Units, Miscellaneous. Inside were handwritten rosters, medical sketches, and a faded photograph, an ambulance painted with the words Blood Unit Mobile. The back of the photo read, "To whoever finds this, remember us." Villanueva spent years tracking down survivors, interviewing them, piecing together their stories like fragments of a shattered mirror. She found Santos, then in her 70s, still volunteering at a rural clinic. The old nurse looked up from a patient and said, "You want to know what war was like? Smell this iodine. That's what courage smelled like." The interviews became a book, then a documentary, then a whisper that grew into applause. The silence of the official story. The newspapers of the 1950s wrote about tanks, invasions, and strategy, but not about women sterilizing scalpels with moonlight. Hollywood made films about MacArthur's return, but none about Orosa's last candlelit transfusion. When Santos was once asked to attend a military award ceremony, she laughed softly. "We already got our medals," she said, holding up her scarred hands. She wasn't bitter, just practical. Recognition doesn't clean wounds, but still, it stings to be forgotten. The rediscovery. In the 1970s, a young historian from the University of the Philippines named Liza Villanueva stumbled upon a box in the archives labeled Auxiliary Units, Miscellaneous.
Inside were handwritten rosters, medical sketches, and a faded photograph. An ambulance, painted with the words "Blood Unit Mobile." The back of the photo read, "To whoever finds this, remember us." Villanueva spent years tracking down survivors, interviewing them, piecing together their stories like fragments of a shattered mirror. She found Santos, then in her 70s, still volunteering at a rural clinic. The old nurse looked up from a patient and said, "You want to know what war was like? Smell this iodine. That's what courage smelled like." The interviews became a book, then a documentary, then a whisper that grew into applause. The ceremony that took too long. In 1986, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, the surviving nurses, now gray-haired and dignified, were invited to Malacañang Palace for a state recognition. The president handed them medals, cameras flashed, the national anthem played. But as the applause faded, Santos turned to Florentino and whispered, "We were heroes when nobody clapped." The remark was caught on a hot mic. The next day's papers quoted it as the headline. Suddenly the nation remembered. School textbooks added chapters about the Angels of Bataan. Museums built exhibits around the rusted remains of their trucks. Children learned their names: Orosa, Santos, Florentino, Luz, and many more who never returned. Yet when reporters asked how they wanted to be remembered, Florentino answered simply, "As nurses, nothing more. That's already everything." Their diaries speak. In the archives of St. Luke's Hospital, historians later found fragments of their wartime journals, words written on torn notebook paper, sometimes on the backs of ration labels. One entry read, "The bombs fell again tonight. We transfused by candlelight. The blood was warm like courage made visible." Another said, "I have learned that hope is not a thing you feel, it is a thing you do." Their handwriting trembled, but their voices didn't. Even after 50 years, the ink smelled faintly of alcohol and rain. What they left behind. By the early 2000s, the last of the blood bank nurses had passed away. No grand funerals, no marble monuments, just quiet graves under frangipani trees. Their epitaphs humble, their legacy enormous. In 2010, a nursing school in Quezon City opened a laboratory named the Orosa Santos Memorial Blood Center. Above the entrance, engraved in bronze, were their words, "To heal is to rebel against despair." Students often pause before entering, as if to absorb the gravity of that sentence. Inside, beside modern centrifuges and plasma freezers, sits a small glass case containing a single cracked blood bottle from 1942, labeled in faded pencil, Bataan, April. It stands as proof that compassion, even when improvised, can outlast empires. The final recognition. In 2021, UNESCO officially listed the Filipina Mobile Blood Bank Unit of Bataan as part of the Memory of the World Archives. A global acknowledgement, 72 years late. When the announcement was made, a Filipino nurse watching from a hospital ward in Doha whispered to her colleague, "They were the first, we just continue the drip." And somewhere, maybe in heaven's version of a jungle ward, Maria Orosa smiled and said, "About time."
Act 10. The blood still flows. Some stories end when the shooting stops, but this one never did. During World War II, the war finished, the flags changed, the cities rebuilt, yet the same pulse that ran through those jungle roads in 1942 still beats quietly beneath hospital floors today. It's in the steady rhythm of plasma pumps, the hum of fluorescent lights, the whispered, "It's okay," from nurse to patient. The blood still flows. The echoes of the angels. In a modern trauma ward in Quezon City, a young nurse named Andrea adjusts a patient's IV drip. She doesn't know it, but the very procedure she performs every day, hanging a blood bag, checking the flow rate, whispering comfort, was born from candlelight in the jungles of Bataan. When she was a student, she'd seen the museum exhibit The Rusted Truck, the cracked bottle labeled Bataan, April 1942. She remembers how her instructor said, "You come from a bloodline of bravery. Every nurse in this country carries that DNA." Now, years later, as Andrea wipes sweat from her brow during another 12-hour shift, she murmurs, "Drive, Orosa, we're still moving." It's not a prayer, it's a continuation. The universal inheritance. In every war, pandemic, and disaster since, there's always been someone, often a woman in white, often unseen, running toward the wounded while others run away. From the field tents of Korea to the flood shelters of Mindanao, their spirit lives on. No weapon can replicate it. No algorithm can automate it. Because medicine, at its core, is rebellion against chaos, against cruelty, against the idea that death always gets the last word. And in that rebellion, the Filipina nurses of Bataan were generals. The ghost truck. Historians say the original blood bank on wheels was eventually scrapped for parts. But some swear that, late at night near old hospital grounds, you can hear a faint rumble like an engine trying to start. The elders tell a riddle. What has no wheels but still moves? What carries no passengers but still saves lives? The answer: memory. In stories told by grandmothers, in classrooms, in documentaries like this one, the truck still rolls on, carrying the heartbeat of a nation. The global legacy. Today, when a nurse in Ukraine transfuses blood during shelling, or a medic in Gaza bandages a child by flashlight, they are unknowingly echoing the spirit of those Filipina pioneers. The mobile blood unit, once a wild improvisation of straw, bamboo, and courage, has become a global standard. Hospitals on wheels, plasma on the move, medicine without borders. And though technology now hums where once only prayers did, the essence is the same. The belief that saving one life, even in the darkest place, is an act of defiance against extinction. The final reflection. If you ask historians what made the Filipina nurses extraordinary, they'll say, their courage was practical. They didn't chase glory. They chased solutions. They didn't want to be remembered. They wanted others to live long enough to remember something. And maybe that's why they matter more now than ever, in an age where attention spans fade faster than candlelight. They remind us that true heroism is quiet, persistent, and patient. Their story is not about war. It's about what survives war. The blood still flows. When the last of them was laid to rest, a Red Cross volunteer placed a glass bottle of red flowers on her grave. No speeches, no medals, just the color that once linked strangers in need. Red for sacrifice, red for courage, red for life. Somewhere, perhaps on a night of soft rain, the ghost of a nurse sits behind the wheel of that old truck. She checks the mirrors, turns the key, and whispers to the dark. All loaded, all living. Drive. The headlights flicker on and fade into history, but the blood still flows. During World War II, they fought without guns. They drove through darkness to keep others alive. Their names may fade, but their pulse never stopped. Remember them, the Filipina nurses who turned courage into science and science into survival. If this story moved you, share it so the world never forgets the women who kept it alive. Subscribe to Hidden Frontlines, where forgotten heroes breathe again.